This is Jeff Badge of the Grinding Doc, and I'm continuing my series on the great works. Sounds like I'm talking about a Renaissance painter, but I'm talking about a Renaissance grinder. The great works of Professor Stephen Malkin, professor of grinding. I'm going to say, I could say professor of University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but he was a bunch of places. But let's just say professor of grinding, and arguably he was the greatest grinder to ever exist. And so this is a series of 10 parts where I walk through the papers. This is part 5. Doesn't mean it's the fifth greatest paper. I'm not putting these in any order, but this is the 5th one in this series. Okay? And if you want to know a little more about Malkin, I do that in video number 1. Let's go to the great paper of Stephen Malkin. And so this is now in 1974. And he is at the University of Texas at Austin, my alma mater, Hook 'em Horns. He was there briefly as a professor before I think he went to Israel after that, and then he went to Massachusetts Amherst, and thermal aspects of grinding. So this is where Malkin started to get into grinding temperatures. And what is the workpiece temperature when we start to grind? And Malkin, being the smart guy that he is, he did not just run in and say, hey, there's a model done by a guy named Jaeger back in 1942, I think it was. He said, hey, there's a model done by a guy named Jaeger. Let's see if it's any good. Let's see if it works. And so in the paper, he walks us through the math of the Jaeger model, and he gets into the hardcore math. And the Jaeger model has some hardcore differential equations that are beyond my capabilities. I did differential equations in university. I did advanced nonlinear partial differential equations in grad school, and it's all over my head. I'd like to say I can handle advanced differential equations, but I can't. That was kind of my limit when I got through my math career. Once I got to multivariable nonlinear differential equations, I started to memorize instead of understanding. And Malkin went through the Jaeger model and figured, okay, what are the assumptions? What are the limits? When does it work? When does it not work? And so we have temperature, distance from the cutting edge, and let's see, workpiece burn. Here he does his homework, and he starts talking about the different types of burn. He breaks it down into oxidation burn, over-tempering, residual tensile stresses, and rehardening burn. That's what I teach in my courses. He probably references Tarasov, another grinding grade who worked for Norton in the 50s. We'll check that. We'll check it now to see. Does he reference Tarasov? There's Jaeger, number 2. And then there's Tarasov, number 8. Yes, because Tarasov was the first guy to really give us a good understanding of the different types of thermal damage. And when I was trying to figure out thermal damage back in 1999, when I started my career in England and then Sweden, I used Tarasov as a reference too. So here we go. He did his experimental work. Here he tells us exactly what his test parameters are. It's maddening when you read some papers and you don't know what their parameters are and you got to figure it out. You got to kind of do detective work, or they just don't tell you at all. Malkin spells it out. There it is. Boom. In plain English and in inches and feet and miles and everything else. Okay? And so here is a famous curve, not from Malkin. This is done by a guy in Japan. Pretty sure it's a guy in Japan, where he looks at the change in hardness due to burn, no burn. He calls burn here rehardening. You could argue very easily that burn is also over-tempering, where you get a decrease in workpiece hardness. I talk about this in my course. I use that curve in my course just like Malkin did. Here he's got the Jaeger model, the equation. And then he starts getting into, okay, what is the Jaeger model? Is it any good? And he gets into the hardcore math. And he says, okay, when does it work? When does it not work? Here he has his half length of the moving heat source. And the Jaeger model is basically you have a surface. You're putting heat into the surface, kind of like if you had an iron. And then there's an equation that says, okay, what is the maximum temperature as it moves across? Based on the time in the hot zone, the heat flux going in, the conductivity of the workpiece. And then you got to be careful because he has an infinite source, but then you've got heat conduction this way. And if it's not an infinite source, which it's not, you have heat conduction to the sides. And Malkin does his homework and he goes, okay, when is it valid? When is it not? And then he uses something called the Pecklet number to say, okay, if it's in creep feed grinding, the Jaeger model doesn't fly, or it has limitations. If we're doing surface grinding with a fast feed rate, it does apply. And he breaks it down to what that Pecklet number is, and then he derives the equations from the Jaeger model and all legitimate stuff, and he goes back to first principles, and he makes sure on his own terms, is the Jaeger model applicable to predicting workpiece temperatures. And this was his first paper. Did many, many papers in temperature, got more advanced, changed it for an inclined heat source, changed it for thermal properties that are dependent on temperature, just to get more and more accurate. But this is his original granddaddy paper on thermal modeling, and that's what I was talking about here. So this is a good, if you want to get into thermal modeling, you can read this. I talk about it in my book of grinding. I do it with pretty pictures and cartoons and stuff. It's easier to digest, but it explains the concepts. And then if you ever want to get hardcore and develop your own thermal model, which I have done, others have done, it gets complicated, Malkin is a good guide to do that. So this is Jeff Badger, video number 5 in the video series of the Great Grinding Papers of Stephen Malkin.